Hey guys, it is April from Getting Hoga With It. Today I wanted to talk to you about the books that I read in both December and January. I didn't do a December wrap up just because of what was going on in my life at that time. So I'm going to do that here and now. So let's get into it. So I didn't really read a lot in December. I read 3 books. Some of them were okay and some of them were awful. So the first book that I read was The Last Christmas in Paris. I was really wanting to read Christmassy books in December. Shocking. And this is a historical fiction book about World War I. This is written in letters, essentially, and we follow our main character, who is female, and she has an older brother who's going to war, and then her older brother's best friend is also going to war. So she is writing to her brother as well as her brother's friend, and this was just a lovely, lovely story. I cried so hard. Now, I was pregnant at the time, and yes, the pregnancy hormones were raging, and I cried like ugly cried at the end of this book. So next year at Christmas time, if you are in the mood for a good historical fiction Christmas read, I would definitely suggest it. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I absolutely despised, and it's Hell House by Richard Matheson. Now, Richard Matheson and I usually get along. Well, I should say that I liked I Am Legend, but I did not like Hell House one bit. I found it incredibly sexist. There was a lot of homophobia in here. I was not scared at all, and the premise of this is that it's a horror book and that these people go to Belasco House, which is meant to be the most haunted house in America. So they go there and see if they can survive the night. And yeah, I will never read that again. I'm getting rid of that book. And I gave it 2 stars. Don't read it, whatever you do. The last book that I read in December was Gilead. Now, this came very highly praised by Katie from Life Between Words, and she was spot on. I just loved the prose in this book. It took me a very long time to get into it and fully understand what was really going on, but this is actually a retelling of the prodigal son in the Bible. Once I figured that out, my heart was just bursting. I was just so emotional reading this. It does take a while to get into it, but if you are patient, it's very well worth it. So this I gave 4 stars. So now we get into January and what I read in January. Now, I did much better in January than I did in December. I read 7 books and I DNF'd 3. So I'm already holding strong to my ditch books that aren't making you happy plan. So anyway, first let's start with what I did read. The first thing I read was What I Know for Sure, and I gave this 5 stars, especially for the time that I read it. I read this right after, during my miscarriage and going in for a D&C. I knew that I needed some Oprah in my life, and so I downloaded this book as an audiobook, and Oprah narrates it herself, and it was exactly what I needed, and I finished it in January, and 5 stars. I love Oprah. If you're not an Oprah fan, obviously you're not going to want to read this, but I most definitely am, and I'm very happy that I read that. Next up, I read The Desire Map. Now, this is actually like a workbook, and essentially the idea is, instead of creating goals that are, you know, I want to run a 5K, I want to get up earlier in the morning. Her idea is that you create goals that are going to make you feel certain things. So your goals are entirely based on emotion. So you do things that will make you feel that emotion. So for me, My goals for 2018 are to feel soft, to feel feminine, to feel energetic, and to feel resilient. And those are my 4 feeling goals. I really enjoy this process. I've done this process once before, like 4 years ago or something, and I'm at a very different point in my life now. And I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4 stars, and I highly recommend, if you are someone who's goal-oriented or just need some change in your life and you're down in the dumps, this helps because it makes you reassess. It makes you reassess goals and how well you're doing, and makes you focus on how you are feeling and moving in the world. So I enjoyed that. I also read Memoirs of a Geisha, finally, and this book, I'm telling you, I loved Memoirs of a Geisha. I gave this 5 stars. If I could give it 6 stars, I would. This is a beautiful, beautiful book about a little girl in Japan who is sold by her family, and she's sold to become a geisha. And so it is her journey to become a geisha, all of the things that she needed to learn to become a geisha, and this had some of the most beautiful lines. I was listening to it on audiobook, and there were many times where I had to pause it and go, yes, like she just understood life and loss and resilience. This is definitely a book about resilience, and one of my goals for 2018 is to read books about resilience, and this was the first one that I read, and what an impact it made. I loved it, loved it, loved it. Why hasn't this author written anything else other than Memoirs of a Geisha? Because nothing else compares so far. I'm just, go and read it if you haven't read it. I also read the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which I really enjoyed. This is another book that is written in the form of letters, and we are following a woman who's a writer, and she receives these letters from people who were part of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And they created this society during World War II when the Germans were occupying the little island of Guernsey. I really enjoyed this story. I have to say that I wasn't completely hooked on the characters the way that I thought I would be. I felt like the characters weren't as flushed out as they could be, and maybe that's just because it was written in the form of letters. That really could be it. But this is such a heartwarming story. I really enjoyed it, so I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Finally, I finally can check this off my list. I've been wanting to read Rebecca for years, and I finally did it, and it did not disappoint. This is a book about a woman who's like a lady's companion, and she meets this man who is most definitely very wealthy, and they strike up this friendship which turns into a courtship, and then he asks her to marry him pretty suddenly, and she says yes, and she moves to Manderley, which is his home. And when she gets there, she quickly realizes that Rebecca, his first wife, is literally everywhere. Now, Rebecca died, and she feels like Rebecca is this ghost in the house. Everyone is comparing her to Rebecca. Everywhere she looks, she knows Rebecca has designed everything, and she just feels kind of stagnated and muffled by his first wife. And oh my gosh, this book was so well written. I felt like I was at Manderley. It's so descriptive. And usually with descriptive books, I can get really bored. and I just want something to happen, but something is happening the whole way through. It's relatively fast-paced in my opinion, and the descriptions were just so vivid. I loved this. Definitely 5-star read from me, and I'm just desperate to read more by Daphne du Maurier now. The next book that I read was The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. This was my first Sue Monk Kidd, and it was wonderful. This was a very feminist book. This is about a little girl who on her 11th birthday, she receives a slave from her parents, which is a very strange gift to give. But this takes place in Charleston, and it takes place in the 19th century. And she does not want a slave. She does not believe in slavery, even though her family owns slaves, and she was kind of raised in a culture where that was just the norm. But she inherently knows that it's wrong. So we follow her, and then we also follow Hetty, the black slave who was given to Sarah. And we follow both of their lives, and what strong women. This was a wonderful book. I didn't expect it to be as feminist as it was, and that was a really wonderful surprise. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4 stars. Finally, the last book that I read in January was The Time Traveler's Wife. Now, I read The Time Traveler's Wife because my sister told me that this is a book about miscarriage, and there is a portion of this book about miscarriage. I was not really impressed by The Time Traveler's Wife. This follows 2 people, Henry, who is a time traveler, and Claire, who is not a time traveler at all. And they meet at various points in Claire's life, and Henry is all sorts of ages when he's coming to visit her from the past or the future. And I think this was an issue for me for several reasons. I don't really like the theme of time traveling in books. I find it really hard because I feel like the author can get really caught up in that trope and trying to track everything, which truly is really, really hard to track everything and timelines and stuff. But I don't usually enjoy that very much because I feel like I can get stuck on that. I also really, really hated Henry. I hated him with a passion. This was a very pretentious book. This is about a very rich girl meeting a very cultured, I would say pretentious man. So here's an example. When Claire is going through a very difficult portion in the book in terms of physical difficulties, she says to him, "Read me that poem," or "Recite to me that poem," which I guess they had always recited to each other, which I don't remember in the previous part of the book. And so he immediately starts reciting it in German, and she's like, no, in English. And I find it annoying that he would even start out in German when he's clearly not German. He is clearly English. English is his mother tongue. This was the most pretentious book I've ever read in my life. What's strange is I've read Her Fearful Symmetry by the same author, and I enjoyed that. Now, I read that in my 20s. I don't know whether that makes a difference, whether I'm just totally unimpressed by things that I was impressed with before, and I don't know if the characters are equally as pretentious in Her Fearful Symmetry, but it was a struggling book for me. There were moments in here about miscarriage that I could relate to. I could relate to Claire. I enjoyed Claire's character the whole way through, even though she was also pretentious and was like a rich girl. Rich, spoiled white girl. But I could relate to her to a certain degree. But Henry, I despised. I despised that man. Gilead. So I ended up giving it 3 stars, mostly because I did feel all the feels. At the end, I was crying my eyes out. So there were, you know, this book had some redemptive qualities to me, but if you don't like pretentious people and you want people to be real, don't read this book. Hello from future me. I completely forgot to mention that I also read Her Every Fear by Peter Swanson. I listened to this on audiobook and I loved this thriller. I was gripped the entire time and I think I gave it 4 stars because the ending was not exactly what I wanted it to be. But this was such a just addictive read, and this was about a girl who moves to Boston. She usually lives in England and she's had some trauma happen to her and she has a lot of anxiety because of that trauma. And she moves to Boston. She actually switches apartments or flats, as she says, because her second cousin lives in Boston and he needs an escape. So they switcheroo and she moves into her new place, and the day that she moves in, her new next door neighbor is murdered. And so of course she's kind of overwhelmed and dives into what in the world happened to this woman. It's her next door neighbor in this apartment building. And this took me on a wild ride that I never expected. I thought that I kind of knew where it was gonna go, and I didn't at all. It blew my mind. I really loved it. So if you're looking for a good thriller, definitely pick up Her Every Fear. And then I DNF'd some books. Now you'd be surprised that I didn't DNF The Time Traveler's Wife, but I was so intent on getting to the part about miscarriage that it took a very long time. I probably would have DNF'd that book if I hadn't been doing that. But I did DNF 3 books, and I'm so freaking proud of myself that I did this because I would not usually do this. So the first book that I DNF'd was Rising Strong by Brené Brown. Now I was reading this because I wanted something to help me out with my grief immediately after my miscarriage. And Rising Strong is a very good book, but it wasn't doing it for me. The problems in Rising Strong were really not big problems. She talked a lot about like fights she'd had with her husband and stuff, and it did not in any way compare to the pain that I was feeling from my miscarriage. So I DNF'd it and I moved on to option B, which really, really did help. I'm still working my way through that because it's emotional every time I pick it up. So yes, I'm glad that I made that switch. It was the right thing to do. The second book I DNF'd was There's Someone Inside Your House. Now this is a YA horror book and it has gotten so much buzz. So many people love this book and I just quite frankly didn't. I should say that I don't usually like YA. It's very rare for me to like YA. So I went in hesitantly, but I thought, you know, this is YA horror, so I'm sure that I'll like it more because I love horror. I love being scared. But there are so many annoying teenage children and their teenage problems, and the way that they talk to each other is just, I'm at such a different place in my life. I just couldn't stand it. So I stopped. I also DNF'd America's First Daughter. Now this was a huge surprise to me because I was so excited to read this, and it has like above 4 stars on Goodreads. This was a lot of America, rah America. This followed Thomas Jefferson's daughter, and Thomas Jefferson in this story was painted, what I read of it, he was painted as being a hero a perfect person. He was just painted as too good for me. Like, he was a person. I'm sure he had faults, and I didn't see any of them here. I also was really frustrated with the fact that it was called America's First Daughter, and we're following this from the perspective of Thomas Jefferson's daughter, and yet I knew nothing about her, because it felt like it was being written as only a way to peer into Thomas Jefferson's life. So she had no character of her own volition. She had nothing. She felt like she was just, she didn't feel like anything. She didn't feel like a character. She was just there, kind of witnessing what was going on within Thomas Jefferson's life. So, yeah, I DNF'd those books. I felt really good about DNFing them. I'm reading really great books now because I made that choice. So, yes, that's everything I read December, January, and what I DNF'd. What was the best book that you read in January? I would love to know, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.